All right, I want to talk to you a little bit today about a class I had to take my senior year of college. I had to take it for my major, one of my majors, which was writing. It was required. And it was a class entitled Looking Backward. And that's all we knew about this class until we got there. It was like I didn't even know what it was. But it was a writing class that encouraged us to look at how people wrote about the past. There are different ways of writing about the past. And so we were investigating this style of writing, and the professor, to help us, had put together an extensive reading list of about 8 or 9 different books that we had to read throughout the semester to take a look at how people wrote about the past. And I thought about them this week, and I did remember some of them. Sandy, if you want to hit the space bar there. This first book we had to read was Hiroshima. Some people pronounce it Hiroshima. Which one do you do? Hiroshima? Yeah. Hiroshima is one of the cities where we dropped the A-bomb at the end of World War II. And so what the author of this book did, he actually went back to Hiroshima and interviewed people who lived through that attack and put together just this account. So it was a straightforward journalistic, here's the facts, here's what happened. A very fascinating book. And this other one, Into the Wild, it was another journalistic book. They actually made a movie about it a few years ago. Some of you might have seen it. It wasn't as good as the book. But this was journalism mixed with some guesswork, because this book was about a kid who was in college, and he seemed to have everything together for him. And he just disappeared from the face of the earth. Until several years later, his remains were found in the Alaskan wilderness where he had been trying to camp out. And the question was, how did he get from here to there? What happened? What was his story? How do we look back? And so the author kind of tried to trace some vague clues to try to piece together what had happened as a way of looking back. Sandy, you want to show us some more? I told you a few weeks ago, this is the only one I didn't get through. Angela's Ashes. It was a memoir of a kid growing up poor in Ireland, and he just wrote about his experiences growing up in Ireland. Memoirs, a very interesting way of looking back. But this other one here, The Woman Warrior, also a memoir written by a Chinese American. She was born to Chinese immigrants in the United States, and she lived in a Chinese community growing up. So her experience was very much as a foreigner in this country, and so she wrote about that, but she mixed it with family legend. So, things that happened before her and stories that had gone through her family, and she looked at how they had kind of shaped her family through the decades in her own life. So it was memoir with family legend. And Sandy, one more. This is Pushing the Bear. This was interesting because the author actually came and spoke to us on campus when we were reading this book. And this was a fictional piece. This was a novel about people who were experienced the Trail of Tears, that is when some tribes of Indians were forcefully removed from their tribal lands, forced to walk across the United States to be on reservations. Yes, thank you. And so this woman wrote about history by writing about fictional people experiencing a historical thing. All different ways of looking back. All fascinating. And in fact, I remembered all this and didn't have to look any of it up. And that was, 17 years ago? Wow. And it's like interesting ways about how people look backward. We like to look back, don't we? Like we look back on our nation's history, on history of the world, our own personal history. We look back. And it's a good thing. Except for sometimes we can get into trouble when we look back the wrong way, right? Case in point, I found a story this week about a husband and wife who were home alone one night. Their youngest daughter had just recently gone off to college, so they were there alone, and they're sitting on the couch. The wife's sitting there. The husband's kind of laying down on the couch with his head in her lap. And she looks down at him, and she takes off his glasses. And she says, "You know what, honey? Without your glasses, you look like that same young, handsome man that I married." And he just smiled up at her and he said, "Oh, thank you, honey. You know what? Without my glasses, you still don't look too bad either." Looking back, but he's going to get in trouble for it, right? Looking back, it can be good, but it can also cause trouble. And isn't that what we experience with car rear view mirrors? We have these rear view mirrors and our side mirrors, and we use them when we drive, right? What do we use them for? To look back, right? To see what's going on behind where we just were. And these are useful, we know, when you're in lots of traffic or if you're going to be switching lanes a lot. And we know how important these are. If anyone ever been out driving and you've needed to switch lanes or something and your mirror was blocked for some way, you realize real fast how important those mirrors are and how good it is to be able to look backward. But what happens if while you're driving, all you're doing is staring in your rearview mirror? What's going to happen? You're going to drive right into something, aren't you? Something right in front of you. So, this idea of looking back, we come to this reality at East Brady Baptist Church as we say, hey, this time is a time of rebuilding for us. This reality is, hey, looking back, it's often helpful. But if too much focus is put at looking backward, we don't see what's out in front of us, and we get in trouble. You can't move forward if all you're doing is looking back. Someone once said, you can't finish the next chapter if all you're doing is going back and rereading the previous chapter. And isn't that true? I have no idea who said that first. But that's what we're up against. As we set out to rebuild here at East Brady Baptist Church, the temptation is to just keep looking backward and keep focusing on what was, right? That's the temptation. I got news for you. We're not the first people to face down this temptation, to just look at how things used to be. Remember we talked last week about how our time we are in now of rebuilding our ministry, our lives as a congregation. That kind of echoes what the people of Israel were going through at the end of the Old Testament, right? Or recall how because of their sin, God had allowed them to be conquered. He had allowed their land to be invaded and their capital city to be destroyed. And most, not all, but most of the people were carried into exile to faraway Babylon, where they were forced to live. And some decades later, King Cyrus, king of Persia, he comes and says, hey, God has given me authority over pretty much all the world, and he says, build for him a temple in Jerusalem. So you Israelites, you Jewish people, if you want, go back and rebuild for me. And so some of them go back. Some of them don't, but a lot of them do. They go back and they begin to rebuild. And as they begin to rebuild, guess what some of them start doing? They start looking backward. They start focusing on what used to be. And in doing so, they threaten to take all the joy out of what God is doing for them right now. Let's talk about what happened. You see, the people returned to Jerusalem. And they got a lot of rebuilding to do, right? Because, hey, the whole city is a shambles. The whole city is a ruin. It was destroyed decades earlier. And if they're going to live there, they're going to have to rebuild it. So they say, yeah, we're going to rebuild. What's the first major project they take on to rebuild? It is the rebuilding of the temple. The temple had been destroyed decades earlier. They're going to rebuild the temple because, number one, that's why the king had sent them back to do, right? He said, build me a temple. But also, that's the center of their identity with God. So they go to work, and they set forth in this work to rebuild the temple. And as they do that, they say, let's have a celebration as we lay the foundation for this new temple. Let's have a celebration. And Sandy, if you show us, this is how Ezra describes it in chapter 3 of his book. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites with cymbals, they took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. See, as they begin to rebuild, they're joyous here. And they come and they're actually having a party. This reminds me a little bit of a wedding reception or a wedding. Because you got the priests, it says in their vestments, they got their special clothes, right? It's kind of like the wedding party comes in with their tuxedos. You know, we have a wedding here, they're here in their tuxedos, and over here, all the ladies are in their beautiful gowns, right? So they got their special clothes. And the priests and Levites, they come with trumpets and cymbals. They're going to have some music, right? So it's like you go to a reception and there's dancing because you got a DJ or a band playing. That's kind of what this reminds me of right here. And notice, as they have this celebration, they're not completely forgetting their past. They're remembering to some degree. They do things as prescribed by David, king of Israel, centuries earlier. So they come together and they're celebrating the blessings God has lavished on them in earlier times. See, remember, it's like having rear view mirrors. Sometimes it's good to look back. And Sandy shows this is how Ezra continues, his talking about this party. With praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. So again, they acknowledge their past, right? God, he's good. His love has endured toward Israel through all these years. How great. And we also see here, it's not just the priests and Levites. It's not just the spiritual leaders who are there having this party. No, everyone's there, right? Everyone. It says all the people. And it says all the people shouted praises to God as they go forth in this work to rebuild in his name. And that's just so exciting when I read that. And I'm like, so many people thrilled to be coming together for God's work. Except not everyone there was thrilled. Sandy, show us the next verse that Ezra records. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. See, many of the older people who were there were not joyous. Many of the people who had lived there before were taken into exile, and now they're back. They're not there praising God while everyone else does. Instead, they stand there weeping. And these aren't tears of joy. These are tears of sorrow and sadness, because they're looking backward. And they're not looking backward for the purpose of remembering God's blessing. They're not looking backward for the purpose of celebrating their heritage. They're looking back for the purpose of still wanting to live there. They still want to be there. They still want that to be the situation in that time, in that place. See, this new temple that they are coming to dedicate the start of construction for, well, it was probably based on the design of the first temple, the one built by Solomon. It was probably a lot smaller and a lot less lavish because, hey, these are people returning from exile who are building this. It's not a rich nation building this anymore, all right? So it's less grand. So some of the older people, all they can see is something different than what they had before. This isn't what I remember. Hey, this isn't what I grew up with when I was a kid. This isn't the way I'm used to it being. This isn't as good as what I had. And because all they can do is look back, their joy is robbed. Everyone else around them celebrating, having a great time. And they stand there weeping. And they threaten to quash the people's eager desire to rebuild, to do the work God has called them to do. All they can see is the past. All they can see is how it used to be. All they can see is what they used to have. They can't see the joy of what God has set before them. He says, go after this, rebuild this. So you can't finish the book if all you're doing is rereading the previous chapter. You can't rebuild into something new if you're looking backward. Let's be honest. Our churches become places where we get stuck looking back like this, right? I mean, we look back. I'm pretty sure the phrase, we've never done it that way before, that started in some church somewhere, right? We know. We've all said it, right? Right? Because we're constantly looking back. The way things were, the way we did things, other people who were there. And that keeps us from going forward. It keeps us from joyfully praising God now. And it keeps us from building what God has for us now. Some of you know this. And if you don't, you haven't been paying attention. Who's going to tell me? What is my all-time favorite TV show? They don't know. You should know. No. Oh, no, that's movie. My all-time favorite TV show is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It's the one no one knows about, which is why it's my favorite. No, and this has been my favorite Star Trek show since the first episode. I mean, it's my favorite. I like this show so much, I actually go and meet the cast members. Sandy, show me the picture. And so you've seen this before, but I show it off every chance I get. This is me meeting one of the cast members to Deep Space Nine about 14 months ago. Look how thrilled she is by what I'm saying to her. I mean, I'm just fascinating to this woman. But That's how much I love the show. From the first episode, you know what happens? The main character, Captain Benjamin Sisko, or Commander Benjamin Sisko at the time, he arrives at a space station, and he soon encounters these aliens that eventually reveal, hey, we're going to destroy everyone and everything going on here. And the reason is because we don't understand you. We don't understand you humans, what you're doing, because we don't understand you. We think you're just constantly lying about who you are and what you're about. So we're going to destroy you. And they don't understand humans because humans live in linear time. Linear time is, hey, something happens, that leads to something else, that leads to something else, and we just keep moving through these series of things, right? That's how we live, right? And the aliens, that's not how they experience things. So they don't understand, so they think humans must be a lie or something. So to save everyone, Ben Sisko tries to explain this idea of linear time. And he's telling them, hey, we learn from experiences and we move on. Something happens and we move on to something else. And the aliens finally say to him, no, we don't believe you. Because we have the ability to look at scenes from your life. And they do, they've been showing them. And in all these scenes, you say you move on, you haven't moved on. They say, you're trapped in one moment of your life. And they show him, he's trapped at the moment his wife died in a battle. And they say, you haven't moved on from this. And it's only when Ben Sisko, he breaks down and he realizes, he admits, yes, I haven't moved on. I've lived in that moment. I've existed here in this moment when my wife died ever since. It's only when he admits that he's able to move on and befriend these beings, and everyone's saved, and it's a wonderful, happy ending. But he had been unable to move on to good things in his life because he had continued to look back and exist in the past. He existed there. It's a wonderfully powerful scene in that first episode. Unfortunately, it's a scene that plays out in our churches today, right? So often we're saying, we exist here, and here is some point in the past. Threatens to overtake us, even now as we're looking to rebuild our ministry together. And I got to tell you, of all the people here, all the people in the congregation, we have a number of our congregation who aren't here today, of all the people, only 2 people in our congregation have worshiped here consistently longer than I have up to this point. Like we've had some people who were here before and they went away for a while and then they've come back. But Mike and Pam, you're the only ones who predate me by about 1 or 2 months, right? So let me tell you, I know what it's like, more than most of you, to be able to say, remember what it used to be like there? Remember what it was like 15 years ago when so many people were so excited about rebuilding that ministry? Remember what it was like 8 years ago when we had 60 people worshiping with us each Sunday morning? I remember 2 years ago when we had 4 pews of teenagers worshiping with us on a regular basis. I remember it all. Wonderful memories, to be sure. But they can be stumbling blocks if that's where we put our focus, if we're not moving forward from there, right? We just keep moving forward. That's what we need to do. We'll become like those people standing weeping at the temple dedication if all we're doing is looking backward. We'll be robbed of the joy. King Solomon, a wise man, perhaps even to this day, the wisest man to ever live. But King Solomon said, don't make that mistake. He said this, Sandy, show us, in Ecclesiastes 7:10, do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. It's not wise. It's not wise to live in the past. He says, it's just not smart. It's his polite way of saying, hey, it's just stupid. Focusing on the past is just stupid. So instead of focusing on the past, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we move forward? And in this case, we fast forward now to the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul has some advice to share for us. And Sandy, if you can show us what the Apostle Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 3. One thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. He says, I forget what's behind. Forget what's behind me. Now, he's not saying I'm failing to remember. Paul isn't saying, I have the power to give myself amnesia. No. This original language comes with this idea as the Apostle Paul, he is refusing to focus on the past. He says, I refuse to do it. Where's his focus instead? It's on something out in front of him, something in the future, right? He says, I'm straining toward it. I am pressing on toward it. These are powerful words. These are words that you believe, hey, Paul, he's looking to the future God has for him, not to the past, but the future, and he's not just going to get there accidentally. He's going to do hard work to get there. He's saying, God has put something ahead of me, not behind me, ahead of me, and I'm going to use every fiber in my being to reach out and grab at it and take hold of it. Now get this, Paul knows what has happened in his life to this point. He knows what's gone on in his ministry. He knows the successes and he knows the failures. Yes, even the Apostle Paul had failures. He knows it. But he doesn't live there. He doesn't exist there. There's no looking back for the Apostle Paul. Instead, he does the hard work of building his life toward the prize God has in store for him. And notice, he doesn't define what it is here. It's so vague that theologians try to put together ideas of what is Paul talking about here. But he doesn't. There is no evidence that Paul knows the things that God is leading him toward as he goes forward. All he knows is he's going forward to it, and it leads him heavenward. It leads him further in his journey of eternal life with God. Doesn't have to have all the answers. He says, I'm just going. God has put something out there ahead of me. You can't finish the book if you're rereading the last chapter. See, in your personal life, you've had good things happen to you. You've had successes. You've had bad things happen to you. You've had failures. Those things, those good things, those bad things, they can mess us up. They can hold us back, right? We can play them over and over again in our minds, giving them the power to trap us where we are or where we were. Solomon says it is unwise to let them do that. Paul says forget about it. Press on, strain forward to what God has for you now. In our ministry together, or in our experiences in church, whether they were here or elsewhere, we've had good things, right? We've had successes. We've had bad things. We've had failures. As we push forward in our efforts to rebuild here, what are we going to do with those? What are we going to do with those successes and failures? What are we going to do with the past? Will we be held captive by failure? Or will we be held captive by the allure of the good old days in church? Joyless in the present, like those people standing weeping at the dedication of the temple construction? Are we going to be paralyzed by past failures? Are we going to let them stop us in our tracks, playing to our fears and feeding faithlessness? Or are we going to be wise and listen to the Apostle Paul when he says, forget about it? Do we have enough faith to believe and hope that God has put something out there in front of us? Do we have enough faith to strain ourselves and to press on toward it so that we can go out and reach out and take hold of something God has put just out of our grasp right now? Do we use our rearview mirrors as a way of getting trapped in the past, or as a way of remembering God's faithfulness, which will propel us into the future? I know my answer is, I know what it's always been. What's your answer? Let's pray.